Welcome to Classical Music Discoveries. I'm David Devine, and today we step into one of the most fascinating chapters of Igor Stravinsky's creative life, his bold and brilliant neoclassical period. After shaking the musical world with the explosive modernism of the Rite of Spring, Stravinsky did something only Stravinsky would dare. He turned backward to move forward. Beginning in the 1920s, he embraced the clarity, balance, and formal elegance of earlier eras, drawing inspiration from Bach, Pergolesi, and the great classical masters, yet reshaping their language with his unmistakable rhythmic bite, harmonic wit, and architectural precision. This was not nostalgia, it was reinvention. Across works like Pulcinella, the Octet for winds, Apollo, and the Symphony in C, Stravinsky forged a new musical identity. Leaner, sharper, and more transparent, challenging audiences to hear the past through a modern lens. His neoclassical voice became one of the defining sounds of the 20th century. Today we explore this remarkable transformation, why it happened, how it reshaped his artistry, and what makes this period so endlessly compelling for performers and listeners alike. So settle in, and join us as we journey through the elegance, the intellect, and the unmistakable Stravinsky spark of his neoclassical years.
In 1913, Igor Stravinsky premiered a piece of music so jarring, so rhythmically violent, that the audience at the Paris Opera literally started fighting each other in the aisles. That was the Rite of Spring. And then, just 7 years later, this same composer turned around and wrote something that sounded almost like Mozart. Today, we're unpacking Stravinsky's neoclassical period, what triggered this dramatic pivot, what the music actually sounds like under the hood, and why this era, running from 1920 all the way to 1951, still shapes how composers think about structure and form. By the end of this episode, you'll be able to hear the difference between romantic excess and neoclassical precision, and you'll understand why this so-called retreat to the past was actually one of the boldest moves in 20th century music. I've got someone here who has gone deep on this, so let's get right into it. Walk me through what we're actually talking about when we say neoclassical.
So the first thing to understand is that Stravinsky's entire output is usually divided into three broad periods: Russian, neoclassical, and serial. The neoclassical period is the middle one, and it's the longest, spanning roughly 1920 to 1951. And what defines it at its core is this deliberate turn toward the aesthetic values of the Baroque and classical eras: order, balance, clarity, economy, and emotional restraint.
Emotional restraint. That's a wild phrase to associate with the guy who wrote The Rite of Spring.
Right, and that's exactly the tension that makes this period so fascinating. According to Wikipedia's entry on musical neoclassicism, the movement was a reaction against the unrestrained emotionalism and perceived formlessness of late Romanticism. It was described as a call to order after the experimental ferment of the first 2 decades of the 20th century. So Stravinsky wasn't just changing his style, he was making a philosophical statement.
A philosophical statement. Okay, so what does that actually mean in practice? Like, what does neoclassical music sound like compared to what came before?
So if you think about late Romantic music, think big orchestras, sweeping emotional arcs, everything turned up to 11, neoclassicism is almost the opposite. According to the Fiveable History of Music notes, neoclassical composers emphasized pared-down performing forces, a focus on rhythm and contrapuntal texture, an updated tonal harmony, and a concentration on what's called absolute music. Music that exists for its own sake, not to tell a story or paint a picture.
So it's leaner, more precise.
Exactly. And according to Kyle Sabo's doctoral dissertation at James Madison University, in his neoclassical period, Stravinsky developed highly refined methods of formal construction, harmonic management, and use of counterpoint. He was essentially reinventing the formal structures and voice-leading procedures of the classical era, but doing it with 20th century ears.
So he's not just copying Bach, he's doing something more interesting than that.
Much more interesting. And this is where the phrase music about music comes in. Musicologist Maureen Carr, in her Oxford University Press book, After the Rite, Stravinsky's Path to Neoclassicism, draws on the philosopher Adorno's observation that Stravinsky wrote music about music. He wasn't just borrowing old forms, he was commenting on them, sometimes parodying them, creating this layered dialogue between the past and the present.
That's a really different way to think about it. It's almost like sampling in hip-hop. You take something recognizable and then you twist it.
That's actually a really apt comparison. And the gateway work for all of this is Pulcinella, composed in 1920. That's the piece where most scholars say the neoclassical period truly begins.
Tell me about Pulcinella, because I know the name, but I don't know the story behind it.
So Pulcinella was commissioned by the famous impresario Sergei Diaghilev, the same guy behind the Ballets Russes, who had also commissioned the Rite of Spring. And the idea was to take works attributed to the Italian Baroque composer Giovanni Battista Pergolesi and reimagine them as a ballet. But what Stravinsky did with that material was far beyond pastiche.
What do you mean by pastiche?
Pastiche is basically just copying the style of something older without adding anything new. What Stravinsky did was the opposite. According to the classical composer analysis of Pulcinella's score, he used melodies that evoke Baroque and classical styles, but his orchestration and rhythmic alterations introduced playful modern dissonances. He respected the source material while simultaneously transforming it.
So it sounds old, but it doesn't feel old.
Exactly. And Robert Kraft, writing in the Cambridge Companion to Stravinsky, put it really well. He said, Stravinsky had the audacity to reinterpret 18th century music with the keenest appreciation for its value and a modern twist, bringing the elements into juxtaposition. That word, juxtaposition, is key. It's the tension between old and new that gives the music its energy.
And what were the specific technical things he was doing? Like, what would a musician notice that a casual listener might miss?
A few things. First, he chose a small chamber orchestra for Pulcinella. That choice alone signals a move away from the massive romantic orchestra. It creates clarity and transparency. Then there's the rhythmic dimension. The score is notable for syncopation and meter changes that were completely absent in original Baroque compositions. So you get this rhythmic vitality layered on top of what sounds like an 18th century skeleton.
Interesting. So the bones are old, but the heartbeat is modern.
That's a great way to put it. And according to the complete era overview of the period, Stravinsky also used polyphony, strict forms, and what they call ironic quotations, moments where he's almost winking at the listener like, yes, I know this sounds like Bach, and I'm doing it on purpose.
Okay, so I want to zoom out for a second, because this is a pretty dramatic shift for a composer. What was actually going on in Stravinsky's world that pushed him in this direction?
So there are a few layers to this. One is personal and artistic, according to Complete Era. By the 1920s, his earlier works had polarized audiences, and he was searching for a fresh, accessible language that could bridge the gap between high art and popular taste. But there's also a much bigger cultural context.
What do you mean by bigger cultural context? Well, Maureen Carr's Oxford Academic chapter on the emergence of Stravinsky's neoclassicism makes the point that the shift from 1914 to 1925 was closely tied to the changing aesthetics of the time. The year 1914 was crucial, not just because of the war, but because it was a moment of intense experimentation across literature, art, music, and dance. And after that upheaval, there was a broader cultural desire for order. Neoclassicism was, in a sense, the musical response to that desire.
So it wasn't just Stravinsky having a personal crisis, it was a whole cultural moment. Exactly. And Wikipedia's entry on musical neoclassicism makes this really clear. It describes the movement as a call to order after the experimental ferment of the early 20th century. And it wasn't just Stravinsky. Paul Hindemith was doing something similar in Germany, coming from what was called the New Objectivity tradition. So there were actually two distinct national lines of neoclassicism developing simultaneously.
Wait, so there's a French version and a German version?
Essentially, yes. According to Wikipedia, the French line proceeded partly from the influence of Erik Satie and was represented by Stravinsky, who was Russian-born but working in Paris. The German line came from Ferruccio Busoni, who was actually Italian, and was represented by Hindemith. Same aesthetic impulse, different cultural flavors.
That's kind of wild. The French neoclassicist is Russian, and the German neoclassicist is Italian.
Yeah, the labels don't quite map onto the nationalities. But that's part of what makes this period so interesting. It was genuinely international. And Stravinsky himself had a pretty expansive view of what neoclassicism meant. In a conversation quoted in JSTOR's Donald Mitchell piece, Stravinsky said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that neoclassicism now applies to all of the between-the-war composers, not just him. He argued that even Schoenberg and Webern, who seemed iconoclastic at the time, were actually using musical form historically, just in a more disguised way.
So Stravinsky is basically saying, we were all doing the same thing, just some of us were more upfront about it.
That's his argument. He said, and this is a direct quote from Conversations with Igor Stravinsky, 1959, "We all explored and discovered new music in the course, but we attached it to the very tradition we were so busily dismantling a decade before." Which is a pretty remarkable thing for him to say.
That's almost a confession. Like, even the revolutionaries were working within tradition.
Right. And it reframes the whole period. It's not that Stravinsky abandoned his radical instincts, it's that he found a different way to channel them. According to the Fiveable Study Guide, neoclassical composers sought to create music that was more objective and detached from personal emotions, emphasizing craftsmanship and technical skill. That's not a retreat, that's a different kind of ambition.
Okay, so let's talk about the actual works from this period. Pulcinella is the starting gun. What else defines this era?
So the complete era overview highlights Symphony of Psalms from 1930 as another landmark. And according to that same source, Stravinsky was drawing inspiration from Bach's fugues, Mozart's symphonies, and even the commedia dell'arte tradition, which is the Italian theatrical tradition that Pulcinella itself comes from. So there's this rich web of historical references he's pulling from.
And the Symphony of Psalms, what makes that one stand out?
It's a choral work, which is itself a departure, and it showcases what Complete Era calls his mastery of neoclassical wit, this ability to blend historical homage with innovative structure. He's working with sacred texts, ancient forms, but the harmonic language is unmistakably 20th century. It's that same juxtaposition we talked about with Pulcinella, but applied to a completely different genre.
So across all these works, there's a consistent thread: old forms, new harmonic and rhythmic language.
That's the core of it. And according to Kyle Szabo's dissertation, what Stravinsky was doing technically was developing an economy of pitch-class set material, which is a musicological way of saying he was being very deliberate and restrained about which notes he used and how he used them. Nothing was wasted. Everything was purposeful.
That's interesting because it sounds almost like minimalism before minimalism was a thing.
And that's not a coincidence. According to Complete Era, Stravinsky's neoclassicism paved the way for minimalism. They specifically mention Philip Glass as someone who was influenced by this tradition. So the line from Stravinsky's neoclassical period to Glass is actually pretty direct.
Okay, I want to push back a little here because I know this period wasn't universally celebrated. There were critics, right?
Absolutely. And this is an important part of the story. According to the Classical Composer article on Stravinsky's neoclassicism, some critics argued that he had abandoned his unique voice and was instead trying to emulate the great masters of the past. Others felt his music had become too polished and lacking in emotional depth. So the guy who was too wild becomes the guy who's too tame. He couldn't win.
That's kind of the fate of anyone who makes a dramatic stylistic shift. And there's a real tension in that critique. Because on one hand, the neoclassical works are genuinely more accessible. They have clear melodies, rhythmic punch, playful references. But on the other hand, some listeners felt that the emotional rawness of the Rite of Spring was gone.
Do you think that critique is fair?
I think it misunderstands what Stravinsky was going for. The Fiveable notes make the point that neoclassical composers aim to create music that could be appreciated for its inherent qualities rather than its emotional impact on the listener. That's a different aesthetic goal, not a lesser one. It's like criticizing a sculptor for not painting. That's a good way to frame it. And what about the legacy? Like, beyond Philip Glass, how far does this influence actually reach?
It reaches pretty far. According to Complete Era, Stravinsky's neoclassicism influenced everything from minimalism to jazz fusion. They specifically mention Miles Davis and even structured experimentation in pop music. And Richard Taruskin, writing in the Journal of the American Musicological Society, put it in really strong terms. He said, Stravinsky's neoclassicism became a fulcrum through which the modern mastery of form was articulated.
A fulcrum. So it's not just one style among many, it's the pivot point.
That's exactly how Taruskin frames it. And when you think about it, that makes sense. Stravinsky was showing that you could be rigorously modern and deeply historical at the same time. That's not a contradiction, it's a synthesis. And that synthesis is what composers have been working with ever since.
And there's something almost counterintuitive about that, right? Because we tend to think of musical progress as always moving forward, always breaking with the past. But Stravinsky is saying, no, the past is a resource.
Exactly. And that's what makes the neoclassical period so relevant today. According to Complete Era, Stravinsky believed music should be lucid, structured, and even humorous. That's a very different philosophy from the idea that art has to be transgressive to be meaningful. He was proving that clarity and precision can be just as radical as chaos.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the idea that Stravinsky's move to neoclassicism wasn't impulsive. Complete Era described it as a response to fatigue and a search for relevance. That's a very human thing. Like, even the greatest composers hit a wall.
It is very human, and I think that's part of why this period resonates. Stravinsky wasn't operating in some rarefied artistic bubble. He was responding to real pressures, audience reception, cultural shifts, his own creative exhaustion. The neoclassical turn was, in a sense, him finding a new way to stay relevant without compromising his artistic integrity.
And he managed to do that for over 3 decades. That's a long time to sustain a creative vision.
It really is. And the range within the period is remarkable. From Pulcinella in 1920 to works in the early 1950s, that's 30-plus years of consistent output, all organized around this core aesthetic of clarity, balance, and historical dialogue. According to Szabo's dissertation, the neoclassical period saw Stravinsky develop increasingly refined methods across all these works, not just repeat the same formula.
So it wasn't a formula, it was a living, evolving approach.
Right. And Maureen Carr's research, which involved years in the archives in Basel looking at Stravinsky's actual sketches, shows how the compositional process evolved. She traces how block form construction methods evolved between the Russian and neoclassical styles, so you can literally see in the sketches how his thinking changed over time.
That's incredible, the idea that you can look at his notebooks and watch the transformation happen in real time.
It's one of the things that makes Stravinsky scholarship so rich. And Carr's book, reviewed in JSTOR's Music Analysis Journal, is described as providing insight into the composer's creative processes and socio-historical aesthetic background. So it's not just about the notes, it's about the whole world he was operating in.
Okay, I want to ask you something that might be a bit provocative. We've talked about how Stravinsky himself said all the between-the-war composers were essentially doing the same thing, working historically. Does that mean neoclassicism as a label is kind of misleading? Like, is it too narrow?
That's a really sharp question. And I think Stravinsky would say yes, the label is too narrow, or at least too often misunderstood. In that JSTOR quote from Donald Mitchell's piece, Stravinsky explicitly pushes back against the naive conception of the neoclassical composer as someone who just rifles through predecessors and rearranges the theft in a new style. He found that reductive.
So he didn't even fully embrace the label himself?
Not uncritically, he accepted it but wanted to complicate it. And Donald Mitchell, in that same JSTOR piece, notes that while Stravinsky rightly pushes back against the naive conception, it can hardly be denied that neoclassical procedures, however subtle, entail a deliberate preoccupation with the past. So there's a real tension there that Stravinsky never fully resolved.
Which is kind of fitting for a composer who spent 30 years in productive tension between old and new.
Perfectly fitting. And I think that tension is actually what keeps this music alive. It's not comfortable, it's not just pretty, it's asking you to hold two things at once, the familiar and the strange. And that's a pretty sophisticated ask of a listener.
And for someone who's new to this music, who maybe knows the Rite of Spring but hasn't explored the neoclassical period, where would you tell them to start?
Start with Pulcinella. It's the most accessible entry point, and it's the work that set everything in motion. According to Complete Era, when you listen to it, you want to listen for clear melodies, rhythmic punch, and playful references. It's described as accessible yet profound. And once you hear how Stravinsky is simultaneously honoring and subverting the Baroque material, you start to hear that same move in everything else he wrote in this period.
And then Symphony of Psalms?
Symphony of Psalms is a great second step. It shows a different dimension, the sacred choral side of the neoclassical period. And it's a reminder that this wasn't just about wit and irony. There's genuine depth and seriousness in these works too.
So when you step back from everything we've covered today, the 3 periods, the philosophical rebellion against romanticism, Pulcinella as the gateway, the critics, the legacy, what's the through line? What's the thing that ties it all together?
The through line is that Stravinsky never stopped asking, what is music actually for? In the Russian period, it was for spectacle and folk energy. In the neoclassical period, it was for clarity, craftsmanship, and a kind of intellectual honesty about where music comes from. He wasn't running away from the past, he was having a conversation with it. And that conversation turned out to be one of the most generative things in 20th century music.
A conversation with the past. And the remarkable thing is that conversation produced works that still feel fresh 100 years later.
because the questions he was asking are still our questions. How do you honor tradition without being trapped by it? How do you be modern without being unmoored? Stravinsky didn't answer those questions definitively, but he showed that you could live productively inside them for decades. And that's a model worth paying attention to.
Here's what this really comes down to. The man who caused a riot in Paris in 1913 spent the next 30 years proving that the most radical thing a composer could do was choose precision over chaos, and mean it. Stravinsky's neoclassical period wasn't a retreat, it was a reframe. He took the forms of Bach and Mozart, injected them with 20th century rhythmic daring and harmonic boldness, and in doing so created a template that composers from Philip Glass to Miles Davis would draw from for generations.
And what's worth sitting with is that Stravinsky himself said all the great composers of his era were doing the same thing, attaching new music to the very tradition they were busily dismantling. Which means the lesson isn't just about classical music, it's about creativity itself. The past isn't a cage, it's a conversation partner.
So the next time you hear something that sounds almost classical but not quite, something with clean lines and a rhythmic twist that catches you off guard, there's a good chance you're hearing the echo of a Russian composer in Paris who decided that clarity was its own kind of revolution.
Thank you for joining us for this exploration of Igor Stravinsky's remarkable neoclassical period. Few composers reinvented themselves with such clarity, discipline, and sheer imagination. In turning to the forms and ideals of the past, Stravinsky didn't retreat, he refined. He sharpened his craft, embraced transparency, and created a body of work that continues to challenge and inspire musicians around the world. From the elegance of Apollo to the crystalline architecture of the Octet and the symphonic mastery of Symphony in C, these works remind us that tradition is not a boundary, but a foundation, one that Stravinsky reshaped with unmistakable brilliance. We hope today's journey has deepened your appreciation for this extraordinary chapter in his life and for the enduring power of musical reinvention. As always, we thank you for listening to Classical Music Discoveries. If you enjoy our broadcasts and wish to support the musicians and productions you hear each week, we invite you to make a small donation using the PayPal link or QR code on your screen. Every contribution helps us continue sharing performances and recordings from artists around the world. Until next time, this is David Devine wishing you peace, inspiration, and beautiful music.